Hi, good morning. So I don't know if some of you have received this email, but Father N sent an email this morning saying that due to the air quality, classes will be canceled and all other events on campus will also be canceled, and certain facilities and spaces on campus will also be closed for today. So in light of that, I decided that I would create a video to walk you through some of the content that I plan for us to discuss and engage with during class, in the hopes that you will be able to access this video and you'll be able to walk through the lecture and you'll be able to learn what we were to cover today, and you'll be able to apply it in such a way that will allow you to do the data analysis for your own research, for your own data. So bear with me, I'm trying this for the first time. So hopefully this will be helpful and resourceful to you. If at any point you have any questions, just email me. I will be in town next week, and so if you have any questions about your project or the data analysis procedure, just send me an email and then we can coordinate a time to meet when we return in November 26th. So I could meet at any point during that time. Since we won't have time to go over data analysis in class, I want to make sure that you have as much support and resources as possible so that you're able to do this with as much ease and feasibility. So we'll go ahead and get started. A couple of announcements. As I said during class on Tuesday, the research paper draft is optional, and we agreed that we would submit that on Monday. If you need a little bit more time after Monday, that's fine, just as long as you send it in, and I'm able to provide you with some feedback before it's due. So at any point, Monday or a little bit after Monday, that's fine, just as long as you send in a draft so that I can give you constructive feedback and comments that you can then incorporate and submit into your final draft, which will be due December 6th. I'm still going over some of the lit reviews, and so I apologize for my delay in getting feedback to you. I hope to be able to get through most of them before the weekend, so I apologize for my delay. In-class presentations will take place on the 27th and the 29th, and I will post the names of the students who signed up for each of these days. I will also be discussing a little bit about research posters, and I'm going to show you some examples of posters that I've done before. And then readings for next class are a chapter from the book Decolonizing Methodologies, and then an article that talks about reflexivity in research and writing. So this is an example of a poster that I completed quite a few years ago. But it basically consists of the purpose of the research, examples of the framework that I used, and then quotes from the data. So you don't have to do a poster that looks exactly like this. The best thing that you can do is you can select maybe 6 slides from your PowerPoint presentation that demonstrate and capture the overall purpose, objective, method, and implications of your research. So you could have one slide that is about sort of the big picture, another slide that's about the method, one slide that is about the community context or the group that you focused on, the participants, the community members, and then maybe 3 or 2 slides that talk about the data, the results. That includes quotes, that includes testimonies, responses that were provided by participants that you interviewed or in the context of a focus group, and then a concluding slides, right? Why does this matter? What are the implications of it? Why is it important? This next slide is a little bit more interactive and more visual, but it also includes the same elements, right? Like I said, it has a section for like the big picture, the lit review, the methodology, the results, and then some examples, specific examples about the research. And so hopefully this will give you a sense of what a research poster looks like and how you can modify your own PowerPoint presentation to be represented in this very organized, very compressed visual representation of your research. And the reason that I'm asking you all to produce a poster so that we can display these and exhibit them as we approach the 50th anniversary of ethnic studies. So starting in the winter and in the spring all the way through fall of next year. And so we want to be able to highlight the amazing work that our students do. And so this poster will help showcase your work and the work that is produced within the discipline of ethnic studies that has been around for 50 years. And we are a very young department. We're only 2 or 3 years old, and so we want to make sure that our campus community recognizes and values the work that we do as a discipline and as a field of study. And so email me if you have any questions about the research poster. Now for thematic data analysis. Thematic data analysis is essentially a method for identifying, describing, and organizing and reporting patterns in the data on the basis of organizing them around themes or main concepts or patterns, right, that are recurring and that are sort of emerging from within the data, right? So similar to how you organize a lit review based on key themes or concepts or ideas or maybe theories and frameworks, you're doing a very similar thing when it comes to analyzing and organizing qualitative data, right? You're looking at the patterns, you're looking at the categories or the themes or topics or main ideas that come out as you're reading your data. And so I'm going to provide you with some examples of what that looks like. But in general, it's one of the most common, most user-friendly methods to use when it comes to analyzing qualitative data and as a way to organize and synthesize these sort of patterns and categories that emerge. So thematic data analysis is often perceived to be very similar to grounded theory, but there are some key differences. We won't have a chance to talk about grounded theory in class. I use a lot of grounded theory just because oftentimes I'm focusing on phenomena or patterns or community experiences that are very nuanced or very unique or bring in very different theoretical frameworks. And oftentimes there isn't a theory or a concept to describe what it is that I'm observing. And so grounded theory is really useful when there isn't an existing concept or theory to talk about what you're observing. And so you're wanting the data or the community experiences and voices to speak for themselves. And so you're generating theory from within the data, from within the community experience. That's the main difference between grounded theory and thematic analysis. Grounded theory is theory that is developed from the data. It's a bottom-up approach. And thematic analysis is theory that is developed in relationship to the literature, right? So thematic data analysis is theory that is essentially derived from the literature. It is informed from what you've read, what you're familiar with. What are the key concepts, the key terms, the theories, the frameworks that are being discussed in relationship to this research topic. So thematic data analysis is about blending the literature with your data, right? So it's about discerning recurring themes and patterns in the data that are reciprocally informed and shaped by the lit review, right? So the codes or the keywords or themes that you are observing in the data have been developed on the basis of your own understanding and interpretation of the lit review. And that's very different from grounded theory. Grounded theory is theory that is being informed by the data itself, not the lit review, right? It's sort of independent, right? And oftentimes it might challenge or trouble or disrupt the lit review, right? The theoretical frameworks that exist. And so those are the main differences between the two. So why use thematic data analysis? Well, one, it's the most convenient, it's the most practical approach to use. Oftentimes when I don't have time to really dig deep into the data and really, explore it and connect with it and put it into conversation with all of the other data that exists, right? And I'm looking at specific things, I use thematic data analysis, right? Because if I already have a sense of what the literature is saying, say, for example, I'm doing a project that looks at the experiences, intersectional experiences of first-generation college students. I'm familiar with that literature, and I already have a sense of maybe what students are saying in the interviews, right? They might talk about intersectionality. They might talk about educational aspirations. They might talk about sense of belonging, right? So all of these keywords have already been informed by the literature, so that when I go into the data and I read through the transcripts, I can begin to see some of those examples come out, right? So in that way, thematic analysis can be very very convenient, very approachable, very practical. Yeah. It's also very useful when you have a small data set, meaning that you're very familiar with what you have in the data, when you're familiar with the narrative, with the interview, with the discourses. If you collected the data, it means you're familiar with it, you know what's there, you know what people said and how they responded. And so in that context, it's very convenient to use thematic analysis. It also aligns with participatory research methods in that you could oftentimes, and you should in fact, share the themes or concepts that you're developing to create your code book with the participants, right? So for example, in other projects that I've done, and we've come up with a set of codes or a set of themes under which we're organizing their responses to various questions around community, sense of belonging, and civic engagement, I'll share these codes with the participants, and they'll say, you know, this one is not as accurate. It doesn't really describe the way that I engage in the community. So in that way, the data analysis piece can also be collaborative, right, and participatory. It can engage community members in that data analysis process. And for most part, procedures, participatory action research, the community members are involved in that process as well. It also allows for open interpretation of the data, but it should also very much be informed by the lit review, right? What's been written, what's been said, what's been done, how does this differ or connect to what already exists? And the last point is that the results can be easily translatable to the general public. Oftentimes what qualitative researchers will do, depending on the audience, is that they will begin to code these different patterns and themes within the qualitative data, and then they'll start to develop frequencies, right? How often did this narrative or story around intersectionality come up? How often do students talk about their gender and, you know, race or ethnic identity together, right? And then they start to develop a set of patterns or frequencies that are then sort of quantified as a way to more fully demonstrate the relationship between these different experiences or patterns in the data. So there are two characteristics of thematic analysis. The first one is inductive. Inductive coding involves coding that is done line by line, meaning that you're reading sentence by sentence and identifying key patterns, key words, or themes in the data, right? You're kind of looking for the words that stand out to you, right? Deductive coding is identifying patterns that reflect the literature. So in this case, a deductive approach is more aligned with thematic analysis in the sense that you are already familiar with the lit review, that you could already think about particular key words or concepts or themes or theories, and then you use those to try to make sense or interpret the data, right? So that these things are in conversation. So codes are typically developed into themes, which are then organized into concepts that reflect these patterns that we're seeing in the data. And it also involves the development of thematic maps or concept mapping, which is an example that we're going to talk about, and that was the focus of one of the readings, to describe some of the links and connections across the various themes and patterns that are being seen and noticed in the data. So there are 6 phases to thematic analysis. The first one is phase 1, which is a close reading, very similar to the listening guide, right? The first phase for the listening guide, the first step, was a close reading, right? To read for the gist. What is this interview about, right? That's phase 1 here as well, so it's very similar. Close reading of the data. Phase 2, generating categories, so identifying patterns. Phase 3, discerning themes, connecting patterns and categories. Phase 4, reviewing themes, connections between patterns and categories. So this is the difference between phase 3 and phase 4 is that phase 3 is about discerning, so identifying them and then connecting them. And then phase 4 is about reviewing them, so reassessing, reevaluating whether there are actual connections between these patterns and these categories. And if so, when do these connections or patterns emerge or linkages surface, right? In the context of what experience? And then phase 5 is defining and naming these things, right? So coming up with keywords or themes or codes, and then providing a definition that corresponds to each of these themes and each of these codes. And then the 6th phase is the write-up and the reporting. So for the first one, right? As I said, familiarize yourself with the data by conducting multiple readings, right? Close readings, right? Reading for the gist, reading for the content, right? Really developing a relationship and a familiarity with the data. It is also recommended that you read through it multiple times so that you begin to understand, you know, what's the content, what are the experiences or patterns that surface the most, and if so, in what context. And as you're doing these readings, I always recommend students to take notes, right? Imagine that you are reading as you would read for any class, right? You're making annotations, you're taking notes, right? Of the key words, of the key concepts, right? So imagine that you are doing that for your own data. Phase 2 involves generating categories. So after you've read the data multiple times and you've sort of taken notes about what you're seeing in your data, you begin to generate categories, right? And these categories refer to those concepts or words or patterns that are coming up, right? That you keep noticing, right? For example, if a student keeps saying that you know, education was a value that was very important to their family, right? Or that family is really important, right? Then that might signal for you that maybe family is a very important theme in this student's experience as a student, right? Or is very central to the student's identity, right? So then you begin to generate a theme or a code for family, right? Family in relationship to education, family in relationship to identity, family in relationship to academic aspirations, right? And these codes can also be produced through a process of inductive and deductive coding, right? So the example that I just gave you about family being a code or being a theme, that's more inductive in the sense that it's coming from the data itself, right? But if I were to develop a code that was informed by the research, then I would probably have the theme of aspirational capital, right? And so that is a word or a concept that is part of this broader theory on, you know, cultural wealth capital, right? That was developed by Terioso, an educator, to talk about the experiences of Latinx, Chicanx students in education, right? So that in itself would be a theme or a code that's already being informed by the lit review, right? For phase 3, discerning themes, this involves generating a list, right? So after you've done these readings, you have a general sense of what's in the lit review, you start to come up with different words or concepts, right, that are sort of emerging from what you've been reading and what you're familiar with. And so once you've generated a list of categories from the data, then you can begin to make connections between these concepts and the lit review, and then these concepts to each other, right? And you begin to generate what's called a mind map or a concept map. And this is a very useful way of organizing and identifying patterns and connections in the data, right? Because sometimes what will happen is you will end up with many, many, many codes. And some of these can be collapsed into broader categories or broader codes or broader themes, right? So that you don't end up with like 30 codes, but you end up with maybe 10, right? And under each of these, there's maybe like subcodes or subcategories, right? So just discerning themes basically involves identifying these sort of broad themes and how they can sort of be organized under each other. So this is an example of a mind map, right? And this is a mind map that we produced in the context of the after-school program with the youth that I worked with. And we were talking about education. What does education mean? And this was one of the mind maps that the students helped generate, right? They talked about education as consisting of these various sort of subjects or topics, right? History, math, science, reading being sort of the sub-themes or the subcategories. And under each of these, then it gets even more specific, right? With science being about biology, being about chemistry, being about physics, right? History being about civil rights, being about the Americas, being about colonization, right? So that's one way to think about thematic analysis, right? That you start to generate all these themes and patterns and concepts and categories, and underneath these concepts or categories, there should be data to back it up and support it, and that some of these can be connected to each other. So this is sort of an example of a code book, right, or the codes that emerged. And this is more along the lines of inductive coding, right? There wasn't any literature that informed this. So another example of thematic analysis, there's this sort of statement here, this sort of quote. Anxiety is a major problem when you have high levels of stress. Sometimes the anxiety is worse than other times, but it can get significantly bad when there is a work-related evaluation. It can be further exacerbated by the fact that I'm the only woman in the meeting. Any relief that I get from meditation is only temporary. Changes need to happen to increase women in the tech industry. So this is sort of a quote. This is sort of a statement from an example of thematic analysis. So what are some of the key words here, right? The key words here are anxiety, stress, anxiety, right? And then you have the different levels of stress or anxiety, right? High, worse, bad, exacerbated, relief, right? So you have the condition, right? Or the main focus of this statement, which is stress and anxiety. And then you have levels, right? The degree of the anxiety or the stress associated with the main concept or theme of this statement, right? And then you have, and then we have other statements, right? That sort of very, very much center the voice of this person, of this experience that's being shared, right? I'm the only woman in the meeting, right? Changes in the tech industry need to happen to include women, right? And then meditation, right? So the red one, the purple one, and the green one are sort of statements that stand out the most, right? And so this is an example of how you would begin to kind of tease apart or begin to analyze thematically qualitative data, right? And the relationship and the connections between these different statements. So for example, one of the key concepts that's being discussed is anxiety. That's being derived from sexism and gender-related systemic forms of oppression and discrimination, right? Implied in the text is that the respondent views anxiety as having certain properties, right, that vary by degree. That's noted in the red, different levels of intensity, right? And so in order to reduce the anxiety, meditation is discussed. However, the impact is only temporary, right? So that particular statement was about describing that person, that woman's experience and relationship to stress and how it's rooted in these systemic forms of discrimination and sexism, right? And then the different levels of intensity of that experience, and then steps that are taken to address it or alleviate it, right? And then these other statements that were very, very palpable and very explicit about her experience. And so this is how it begins to sort of get coded within phases 3, 4, and 5, right? There are these categories, these sort of patterns: work-related stress, implicit bias, sexism, underrepresentation of women in tech, right? So there's this sort of theme of stress, right? And the sources or structural root causes for that stress. Then there are stress reduction techniques, meditation, and there's a typo there, sorry about that. And structural changes in tech, right? As ways to reduce or address these sort of levels of anxiety. And then, of course, the levels of intensity, high, low, and temporary. So this is one way in which you can begin to sort of analyze that text, to create categories, right? And so then these 3 themes become the sort of subheadings or headings in the results section of the paper, right? Stress, what is stress? How does it manifest, right? What are stress-related techniques that are being used? What are the levels of intensity, right? And so that's how you begin to organize and make sense of the data, yeah? So then after you've done this sort of process of organizing and visualizing the data, after you created a list of themes, you must then verify if the themes you discerned relate back to the data, right? So then you would go back and see, you know, is there an example for this? Is there an example for this, right? That can support the existence of this theme, yeah? And whether it relates back to the broader data, the data as a whole, right? And if it does, then you've developed codes. You've developed these sort of themes. Yeah, I use the word codes and themes interchangeably, right? Typically, I use codes when I have some sort of frequencies, right? Or the qualitative data has some element of quantitative numerical representation. But they're, in a sense, referring to the same thing, right? The category or the theme, the main concept. And if some codes might not be necessary, then that means you have to rethink about that particular statement and what it means. So after you've agreed on a select number of themes, you must define what these themes mean or what they represent. You must generate a clear definition of these themes such that when you are analyzing the data, the theme that you developed could be very easily discerned to be defined and described in that particular way, right? And so if you have once you have a theme, you need to have a definition that describes what that theme, what that code is referring to and representing. And with that, you begin to develop a code book. So for example, in one of the projects we worked on with the youth, these were some of the themes that they developed, right? So these are the key words, right? The themes here. And then each theme had a code, which is a number, right? 1, 2, all the way through 12. And then each theme had its own definition. So this becomes a code book, right? This becomes sort of the guide that can help others analyze and make sense of the data as well, right? So when you're doing participatory action research and you're working collaboratively with different community partners and researchers, you don't want to be the only one that's analyzing the data because you have particular biases and assumptions that could really distort or misrepresent the data. So when you have other people co-analyzing the data with you and collaborating with you on that process, they might have a very different perspective. And when you're working together, it allows for the data to be analyzed more deeply, more complexly, and more fully, right? And so the creation of this code book in collaboration with community members allows them to also make sense of the data and tell their own story. So when this code book is produced, everybody gets a copy of it and everybody goes and analyzes the data on their own, right? And then you come back and you see what you've analyzed and you see if there are any differences or similarities, right? And so this code book becomes really important because then it's the guide to assist others in making sense of the data. Does that make sense? And so we did this with the youth, right? The young people had these definitions, and many of them thought that there were too many definitions, and they wanted to see what were the relationship between each of these themes. And so what we did was a concept mapping activity, right? Each of these definitions, had its own theme, and so we glued these definitions to a chocolate, and then we had the youth kind of group them together conceptually. And so this was the concept map that they developed, right, from this code book of definitions, right? They decided that the word communication was connected to safety and was connected to love, right? So in that sense, this here was its own cluster, right? And it was sort of connected to opportunities, and opportunities were connected to diversity, connected to struggle, connected to powerless, right? So this represented another cluster. And then education was connected to school, connected to resources, connected to education, right? And the community was connected to its history. So by clustering these different concepts, students were making these conceptual relationships more meaningful, right? Between each of these themes and each of these patterns. So out of the 12 themes, 4 categories were discerned, right? There were 4 clusters, each one with 2 to 4 categories, right? Diversity was clustered with opportunities and powerlessness and struggle. History was clustered with community, which is a little bit hard to see here, but it's history. And so that's one example of thematic data analysis, where you begin with these sort of list of themes, and then they are sub-organized or sub-categorized into more specific and concrete themes. And then the last phase, which is the write-up and the reporting, basically involves you synthesizing the information, synthesizing and summarizing the patterns in your data, right? It allows the reader to understand how your data relates back to the lit review. What is the connection there, right? And that's why it's really important to write a lit review that is organized by the subheadings or headings and key concepts and terms, so that then you can connect it back to the data. And it also allows the readers to understand how your data answers your research question, right? So together, this process allows you to produce constructive results from your research in an organized and theoretical way, right? So as you're doing your own thematic data analysis for your own project, go back to your research question, right? What experiences or what stories, what narrative, what discourses from the data that you've collected answer that question, right? Then 2, what key concepts or terms from your lit review stand out to you? Write those down in the results section of your paper, and then see how it is that they are emerging, if at all, in your data, right? And then begin to make those connections. And that's how you begin to engage in this process of thematic data analysis. Yeah. So that's the last slide for this lecture, and I thank you for bearing with me, and so hopefully this is helpful and constructive and useful to you. I apologize that we weren't able to cover this earlier in the quarter, but I do hope that you'll enjoy this process of discovery and of playing with your data and discerning and making sense of the very meaningful and powerful stories that groups that you've interviewed have shared with you. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I won't get a chance to see you, but I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving break and a wonderful time with your family and loved ones. Thank you.